I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Strongpoint segregation of duties implementation process and how it's faster and simpler and safer than the traditional way of doing things. So typically, segregation of duties projects begin with the analysis of a bunch of rules, usually a library of rules, and Strongpoint is no different. We have a library of rules that can be used to test your roles and your role assignments to understand any conflicts within. And when this is done, typically it results in a series of violations that need to then be cleared and explained. And those violations will then be reviewed by your auditors to make sure that they are rational and that you have effectively resolved any segregation of duties problems. However, also typically, many, if not in fact most of these violations are what we call phantom violations. They're violations that relate to the permissions or the permission assignments, either within one role or across multiple roles, but they don't represent actual behavior in the system. And so therefore, every Strongpoint SoD implementation project begins in a totally different way. I'll give you an example. One of our customers, a very prominent unicorn, had completed an initial SoD review process using a traditional tool, an audit-based tool. And the result that they got back was that every single user role and every single employee had a violation of one kind or another that needed to be cleared. Tens of thousands of violations. And when they asked the person doing the audit what they should do next, they were advised that they should go through and redesign all their roles in order to eliminate these conflicts. And there was no guidance on how to do that. So, of course, everybody who's familiar with NetSuite understands that redesigning all your user roles means essentially retesting the entire system. So if you remove functionality that people are using by mistake, you would need to retest the entire system. So they came to us and they said, look, you guys are the guys who understand all the interdependencies between things. You must have a better way. And of course we do. So the way we approach it is to get rid of the phantom things first. So we do an access review. And an access review is something you'll do on a regular basis after you go live with segregation of duties. It's a separate access control. And we take a very data-centric approach to how we recommend people do access reviews. And the first thing that we want to look at is any of the user roles that are not assigned at all. So we have tools for detecting these, and we locate any of the user roles that have not been assigned to anyone. And you really can't do this search without using Strongpoint. It's very, very difficult. You make a spreadsheet and you crunch all the data, but as you just saw, it just made a few seconds to figure this out. And what this means is they're not being used. And for your auditors, you're going to want to remove, or for segregation of duties projects, you're going to want to get rid of those. And you can just go through and simply inactivate them. So if nobody's using the Flow Partner Center, you can inactivate it. If nobody's using the standard Customer Center, you can inactivate it. If nobody's using the Advanced Change Manager or the Advanced Internal Auditor or any of these other roles, the DocuSign for NetSuite configuration role, even if these roles come from managed packages, if you're not using them, inactivate them. And you inactivate them right at the user role setting. And once you inactivate them, you will no longer have any violations either within those roles or between those roles and other roles. And typically this relates to old roles, and it relates to roles that come as part of, they're either standard roles or roles that come as part of a managed package. And you can just simply go in and activate them. And when you inactivate them, they won't be available to be selected. So you're not going to have an SoD problem in the future. The next type of cleanup that we recommend people do right away is to look at all the roles that are assigned to find any that aren't being used at all. And a great example of this is this test role that we created. It is assigned, but it hasn't been used at all. And this is just another example. So in the first case, we had things that weren't even assigned to anyone. These are assigned, but they haven't been used. And you can, again, go and solve this in the same way by just going through and find the test role here and inactivating it. When you inactivate it, it will remove it from all of the users. So we've now cleaned out the really obvious stuff, but let's sort of dig in a little bit further. The next thing we want to look at is any role assignments with no login in the past 6 months. So this means that they are assigned, the roles are assigned, they are being used by some people, but not necessarily by these people. And so here we can go down and we can see a list of people and the roles that they have assigned to them that they haven't logged in in 6 months. Well, I think as a general principle, if you haven't used a role in 6 months, there's no risk in removing it. And you can go through and now go to these employee records and pull these roles from them. And that will greatly reduce any conflicts that would arise from this. And sometimes when we run this, we see hundreds of these. One of our other customers, a large, privately owned but very large health services company, had thousands of these. And the reason was that when they transitioned from their old roles to their new roles, they were working with one of the big 6 advisory firms, who actually brought us in, by the way. They had kept all the old roles just in case they needed them. And it wasn't clear that, every once in a while somebody would log into one of those roles. So it didn't fall into bucket A or bucket B, but we were able to identify hundreds of people who were not using those roles and then make a plan to get rid of them. Now we're getting down into some fairly tight things, right? So now we're left with running our SoD rules only against roles that are actually in use by real people. And so any of the conflicts that are in here, you'd think would be real conflicts, but that's not true. There are usually a big supply of phantom conflicts in this as well. And so, for example, right here, I have a list of unresolved SoD incidents, and I've actually restricted it just down to one rule, just so we can take a look at it here. And so we can see the incident. This is from testing our rules, and we see that you shouldn't have the ability to create an invoice and also make a journal entry. And the reason for this is that you could use it to create fraud, right? So you could create fraudulent invoices and then cover your tracks in some way. And we see that there's violations on the flow accountant role, the flow CFO role, and the flow bookkeeper role. So normally what people do is they go out and they start talking to people who use these roles. They have to go try to find out who's got these roles, and then they go and they talk to people about whether they should remove this permission. And people are very reluctant. First of all, this takes a lot of time, but people are very reluctant to give you a firm yes or no, because often they have the permission in case they would ever want to use it. That is SoD project hell. You do not want that to happen. You want to make the decision in advance that any time you find somebody who hasn't used a permission in more than a quarter, you're going to pull that permission from them. And an important thing to note here is we're not saying take away the permission completely. We're talking about switching it to view. And that means they will still be able to see the data, but they won't be able to create, edit, or delete the data, because all of the SoD violations come from the ability to create, edit, or delete things, not the ability to see things. So we can we can simplify and say, we're not going to change the whole process. We're just going to, when somebody never in the process edits or deletes things, we're going to go and clear it in that way. And we can very, very quickly check for this by simply running a search against, in this case, I'm looking for, well, let's take a look at invoices and journals, and let's look in the last 90 days whether any of these roles have actually been involved in doing this, right? And so I take a look at it and I see, well, first of all, the flow CFO role doesn't do either of these things. This is a typical example of over granting permissions. That makes sense, right? The CFO doesn't actually go in and edit transactions. The CFO is doing financial modeling and planning the business with the other C-level people. They don't actually engage in transactional behavior. So the CFO just has the wrong permission level. And we can see here that the flow accountant really does use both of these things. So we're going to need to deal with this in a detective control way or an approval way this is a real conflict right here. But the flow bookkeeper doesn't. They just do one side of the process. So they do invoicing, but they don't do journaling. In this case, what we can do is we can simply go into the role. This is the Flow Bookkeeper role here. And quite safely, although I recommend, obviously, we're going to do this in Sandbox first, and we're going to get approval before we move this into production. But with great confidence, we can say, let's go down to make journal entries here. We could switch this. I'm not actually going to switch it because it's actually a production account, because I'm looking at the data here for you. But we can set this to view. And what that'll mean is the bookkeeper will still have the visibility of the journal entries, but will no longer have the ability to edit them or create them or delete them, right? And so this will resolve that conflict. So if you make that change, this will resolve that conflict for that role. We do a similar change to the Flow CFO role, but we're still left over with the Flow accountant. And the normal thing that you would do with the Flow accountant role would be to, what people would say is split those responsibilities. So you can't have one person doing both things. Well, that's not possible in our company. We don't have enough people to split that up. It's part, what's going on is invoicing. There already is a segregation of duties between the people who can create sales orders and the people who create invoices, and the accountant's the person who create invoices, and that keeps a good segregation of duties for us. But the appropriate thing is then to create an agent control, our detective control system. Don't modify the user role. Put in place a review of all the journal entries or all the invoices, whichever is the one that's the exception, and have the CFO sign off on that list. We'll cover that in a separate video at some point, but agent controls turn safe searches into real provable detective controls. And so it's very easy to trap this and have a end of month review, and the accountant, the Flow accountant role users know there's going to be that review. That effectively mitigates the risk in almost every situation. So actually editing the user roles to remove permissions and split them up is the last thing you would want to do. And it will happen. There will definitely be situations where you and your auditors will sit down and go, no, really, you can't have the same person doing both of those things, but it should be the exception. And if you plan things accordingly, and if you treat access review as the first step in your SoD implementation, it will go much more smoothly, much more quickly. And then moving forward, instead of having to involve everybody in ongoing access reviews, you'll use the same process again on a quarterly basis to do access reviews that are data-driven, incredibly fast, and incredibly efficient. Hope that was interesting and useful. If you have any questions, please engage with our team. We'd love to walk you through it and learn more about your challenges. Thanks for your time.